Good morning, good afternoon, dear participants and speakers. I'm Daria Oneshko, Associate Program Officer on Gender Equality and Youth at the Community of Democracies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on behalf of the Permanent Secretariat. The event is on Engaging Women in Sustaining Peace, 20 years after the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. Together with our distinguished speakers, we will discuss the achievements and progress made by the international community in strengthening women's participation in peace processes, peacekeeping, and conflict resolution. Please use the chat to pose your questions during the event, and we will come back to you during the Q&A discussion. Without further ado, let me introduce the moderator of today's event, Mrs. Sharon Bagman-Rolls. Sharon has been working on the localization of the Resolution 1325 since its adoption on October 31st, 2000, and contributed to the development and the adoption of the Pacific Regional Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, or WPS. She served on the United Nations High-Level Advisory Group on the Global Study on the Resolution 1325 and contributed to the successful inclusion of climate change in the Resolution 2242 adopted this year. Also, as Gender Liaison of the International Steering Committee of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflicts, or GPAC, since 2009, she has successfully contributed to the adoption of the gender transformative approach to the application of WPS in conflict prevention and human security action across the global network. She also contributed to the establishment of a global network of gender focal points across the 15 regions of GPAC. Sharon continues to work on progressing the peace development humanitarian nexus approach in her advocacy work at regional and also global levels. She is also presently at the task force as a member of the Generation Equality Forum WPS and Humanitarian Action Compact. Sharon is also a good friend to the Permanent Secretariat, and she currently leads the development of the Women in Peace Building Stories, a media initiative of the Community of Democracies that you can find on our website. Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daria, and thank you to the Community of Democracies for the opportunity to moderate today's discussion, Engaging Women in Sustaining Peace, 20 years after UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And it's certainly a wonderful privilege to be able to bring to this proceedings also some reflection from my Pacific region. The 20th anniversary of the landmark Security Council in 25 this year. An opportunity to enhance accountability and identify ways commitments of the last 2 days can bring about transformative change. As we all know, adopted in 2000, the resolution reaffirmed the critical role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, including peace building, peacekeeping, and in humanitarian responses. It also stressed the importance of our equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. As we all know, the WPS agenda is not only about women. The WPS agenda actually precedes the adoption of 1325, and 2020 has to learn from progress or lack of thereof on strategic actions adopted in the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action. The narrative has indeed shifted to some degree from women in armed conflict to a greater focus on prevention and sustaining peace, including in the context of relief and recovery. As the 9 subsequent Security Council resolutions adopted between 2001 and last year provide a series of guidelines about how to integrate gender equality and women's rights in peace building, peacekeeping, preventative action, and the humanitarian agenda. 1325 has indeed been key to connecting the Security Council to local women peace builders across the globe who have localized the resolution, recognizing it as an entry point to engage with the UN system, member states, intergovernmental organizations and agencies in the work of prevention and sustaining peace every day. But despite all of that, what women have contributed, and with all the talk of meaningful participation, there needs to be greater recognition that the WP is driving human rights accountability from the Human Rights Council and across the UN peacebuilding architecture and into the humanitarian sector. Young women are calling out now more than ever to be part of the sustaining peace agenda. Regional intergovernmental organizations, national parliaments, the defense and security sector have a clear role in applying the recommendations of the 10 WPS resolutions to enable women peace builders and our civil society networks to bring our work on human security into the formal spaces of decision making, because we all want to address the root causes of conflict and enhance protection and prevention. As Daria has already mentioned, the WPS agenda is also an important anchor in humanitarian action, as we are seeing this week the launch of the WPS and Humanitarian Action Compact of the Generation Equality Forum, which actually reflects the need to link the WPS agenda to intensify national and local disasters, health pandemics such as COVID-19, as well as the displacement and migration caused by the climate crisis. One of our Pacific recommendations in 2015 also saw the real change infused into UNSCR 2242. And finally, I think we also need to be talking about sustained and flexible financing as a key measurement of accountability. In my own region, while we did have the first regional action plan on WPS in 2011, we did not have the resources to implement. We found that peace and security remained limited to violence against women response programs and crisis response, not conflict prevention. But as women, we continue to find innovative ways to support our participation, building coalitions, organizing convenings, from women-led consultations and peace education to just sitting on the mat and talking, as well as initiating multi-stakeholder dialogues. So, 20 years on, how can the UN Sustaining Peace Agenda enhance the engagement of the diversity of women working on and across the foundational pillars of 1325? So let's hear from the women who are doing just that. Our panelists tonight include Ms. Marita Sohem Rensvik. She's Norway's Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, involved in bilateral, regional and multilateral processes related to women's participation and rights in peace processes, peace building, humanitarian work and international operations. She's a member of the Nordic Network of Women Mediators and part of the Norwegian branch's steering group. Since joining the Norwegian Foreign Service in 2006, she's worked on human rights and gender, climate change, food security, and African affairs. Before entering the Foreign Services, Marita, who is also theologian, served as an elected member of the National Council of Churches in Norway. Chief Superintendent Raluca Domuta, Romania, currently serves as a cybercrime specialist at the Organized Crime Branch. In 2015, Chief Superintendent Domuta received the International Police Peacekeeper Award for her exceptional and outstanding leadership in response to the Haitian earthquake in 2010, where she was on deployment with MINUSTA. During her deployment, she worked closely with the Haiti National Police on the development of the gender program and contributed to establishing a one-stop center for victims on sexual gender-based violence. And from the Philippines, Ms. Linrose Genon is a member of the Executive Council of Young Women for Peace and Leadership, a network of young women and young LGBT leaders from the Philippines who are agents of peace and advocates of human rights, women's rights, gender equality, and peace and security. She's also the co-director of Project YACAP, Youth Amplifying, Co-Creating and Advocating Peace, a youth leadership development program for peace which envisions to build a network of young people in Mindanao with a view to nurturing a culture of peace. She's currently a faculty member at the Department of English of Mindanao State University, Iligan Institute of Technology. Welcome to you all. It's such a privilege to have you as part of our conversation today. Let me please start with Ms. Soham Rensnick. Considering Norway's global leadership in facilitating peace processes across the world, how do you think the state of women's participation in peace processes has changed in the last 20 years? What are the gaps and challenges you are seeing that are still undermining women's involvement in peace and security? Marita.
Thank you very much for these kind words, as well as for inviting me to take part in this distinguished panel. And I will start on an optimistic note, because a lot has happened in 20 years, as you also referred to. Looking back, we have to admit that women's participation and rights did not feature prominently in the majority of peace processes in the 90s. Today, such an omission would be unthinkable. We now have too much data and experience not to take women's participation into account in some way or another. We have networks of women mediators that clearly demonstrate that competent and experienced women are ready to be consulted, engaged, deployed. And it is very hard now to claim that the right women cannot be found. We have models for inclusion that, despite not being perfect, provides a way forward when the parties' delegations themselves do not include women or do not consult civil society properly. So the parties' no is no longer an absolute end to the discussion. We have a growing body of research that indicates that it makes a huge difference whether women take part or not. And so it's difficult now to claim that inclusion can wait when evidence suggests that it's vital for success. Today, there are policies and plans in place. 86 countries, as well as regional and sub-regional organizations, have action plans for women, peace, and security. Training has changed. Monitoring is improving. We are still far from where we need to be. That has to be said. The figures are quite disheartening. The progress is way too slow, but it is becoming easier to do the right thing and harder to disregard our obligations. We know now what is required of us, and the global community and local activists know it too. So definite progress, but much in the commitment and plans and ad hoc initiatives. Now to the barriers and the way forward. First, we must do more to level the playing field from the very start. One barrier to women's inclusion appears to be that they're not involved and informed to begin with. We cannot bring anyone to a table that doesn't exist, and discretion might inhibit us from discussing exactly what we're talking with the conflict parties about. But even before the conflict parties are brought to the negotiation table, we can and should reach out to women's organizations to find out what their needs and priorities are. If the agenda has been and the delegations have been decided before women are brought in, inclusion will be all the more difficult afterwards. Therefore, identifying key women that can play a role in the future process is not just about that phase, but it's also investing in the future process. Second, we have to learn from other processes. Ask ourselves, how has inclusion been made possible elsewhere? What made it difficult? How were the difficulties overcome? Because one barrier to women's inclusion seems to be the steady reinvention of the wheel. From the Norwegian side, this is a focus at this point, that our teams, two different processes, share experiences, for instance, in an annual gathering. Third, we need to retain the focus on women's participation even after a peace accord has been signed. We know from experience that this phase might be long and hard, and that backlashes may occur. And so we must support the parties and civil society's efforts to promote women's representation in constitutional committees and security sector reform, in transitional justice, peace monitoring missions, because a barrier to women's inclusion seems to be that the focus dwindles when an accord has been signed. Agreements must not only be agreed, but also implemented by women and men alike. Finally, women peace builders and human rights defenders are increasingly being harassed and threatened, violated and killed. And this is an unacceptable barrier, a huge human rights problem, and a big problem for our peace and security efforts that depend on their contributions. Therefore, their security must be our priority. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Marita, for your interventions and a reminder that so much has now have abundance. We continue to learn, and there can no longer be an excuse in terms of where are the women. You yourself are part of a Women's Mediators Network, but we need to continue to persist in terms of participation and also continue to protect women to be part of long-term peace building, which is starting to change within the peace building architecture. Thank you again. Damuta, Ms. Damuta Marga Raluca, what, in your opinion, is the best strategy to increase the number of women in peacekeeping? When you and I spoke about your story for the Community of Democracies, you talked about how as a young girl you thought about joining the police force and you went on to discover these processes that included peacekeeping. But for a young woman today in any part of the world who might be thinking about these role models who now exist through the UN peacekeeping system, how can she join? How can we encourage young women to also take on these leadership roles? Over to you, Raluca. Thank you.
What can I say? Okay. Hello again. So what can I say? I'm just talking from my personal experience because as you said, I started questioning gender-based assumption a long time ago. Well, I didn't used to call it that way because I was just a teenager. As I come from Romania, a country where men and women, they have equal opportunities. But 25 years ago, when I dreamt of attending a military school, I was still 14 and I wanted to go to a military high school. I found out that in Romanian military schools, there were no places allocated for women. So I had to just go and have a general school, high school, which I graduated, and then when the moment came to go to police academy, we had in 1995 we had allocated in Romania 20 places for girls and more than 354 men, which was the competition was very high. When you think of this number, it was allocated for the whole country. Speaking of now, the situation is different. We in Romania, for example, now either if you're a man or a woman, there is no quota for that for attending any kind of military school. Women may occupy any military or civilian position if they meet the competency criteria required for military branches and specialties, with no legal restriction. But this change came in 2007, so we are speaking about 12 years, which, from my point of view, I think it's a huge change from the perspective of equality. What I can say again from my experience is that women and men, they are equal, but when we are discussing about going into a peacekeeping mission, for us, for women, it's more difficult because we don't have just our profession. We are also mothers, and we are wives. So basically, I feel like we have more than one job to do. And what I can advise other women who want to go and follow a military career or a peacekeeping career, I can say that we should value ourselves more, because we can change much in our peacekeeping mission, in the peacekeeping missions, from the perspective of our own example. And also, we shouldn't be afraid to dare. We have to be courageous. Although I have 2 boys, and I'm always teaching my boys, don't be afraid, dare, go, be courageous. But going into the park with other mothers, I only hear mothers of girls saying, you have to be perfect, you have to learn, you have to do things the right way. I don't say that the right way is in the correct way, but when we talk about education, we have to teach our girls to dare more. We have to teach the women that we work with to dare and to keep on going with their challenges. And again, never give up. We always have to give ourselves as examples to other peacekeepers and also to the women that live in the host countries where the missions take place. I'm giving the floor to you now.
Thank you so much. And so important that even, well, it's been a really long time since the Decade of Women in 1975, but even if you think about since 1995, that we still have to keep reminding our education system, we still need to be reminding our communities and our societies that girls can do anything, but also at the same time, the important role of women peacekeepers in whatever the deployments, particularly from women in the ground, particularly in the receiving countries, as you said. Let's move now to somebody who's going to bring that young woman's perspective. Ms. Genon, as young women peace builders are the future of the WPS agenda, and they're driving it, and they're going to continue to move this agenda forward for many decades. What's resources are needed now to support and strengthen the participation of young women like yourselves, the diversity of young women who you work with, to be able to say, to make you help you feel and really believe that you are equal participants in shaping your communities and societies and also influencing regional and global agendas? Over to you.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. I was 5 years old when we first have. I'm 25 years old now. I was 5 years old when we first have the WPS agenda. So for me, it's a privilege to be part of this discussion today. And I'm happy to represent the Young Women Plus Lead Peace Philippines, a program of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. So in my perspective, I would start with saying that young women and male allies play a vital role in the present and future of women peace and security agenda. And on the question on strengthening inclusive and meaningful participation, I think I will start with a recognition. What I mean by that is that stereotypes around gender and age can cause invisibilization of young women, which leads to their exclusion from participation, action, and access to opportunities because of their age and sex. And often, like initiatives like targeting youth, as I've observed in our context, especially in conflict and post-conflict areas, tend to favor young men, while young women remain largely seen as victims and are left out at home as primary carers, and even framed in the guise of the narrative of protecting them. So and also, like, similarly, young women tend to be excluded from initiatives aimed at engaging women's leadership and participation in different levels and stages of peace processes, as they may be considered too young. So I think to strengthen participation, the conversation starts here. And we need disaggregated data to ensure that women do not fall in the cracks of double marginalization. And I like that you mentioned earlier about the diversity of youth and the diversity of women, because that's my second point, because we need to recognize that youth is a diverse group and gender is one axis of difference. And women also is a diverse group and age is one axis of difference. When gender intersects with other forms of identity like age, if you're a woman and you're young, you have different experiences, you have different needs, and you're disproportionately affected by social challenges in the community. For instance, I'll cite one example example, in the Philippines, out-of-school children in our country stand at around 3.6 million, and 2.4 of them roughly are females. And the Department of Education this year said that the number of out-of-school youth this year reached 4 million because of the pandemic. With the education system shifting online, we need to really think about how we can give, like we need to prioritize, we need to give young women fair opportunities and resources online. Also, in our context, young women, are still one of the worst impacted as patriarchal values continue to reinforce women's lack of socioeconomic power, and they are more susceptible to poverty. Among the roadblocks of young women that we have worked with for participation is lack of financial resources, few capacity building and mentorship support opportunities. Some of them, lack of exposure and visibility, and insufficient access to relevant networks. For instance, in the time of COVID, for example, stay-at-home measures of the enhanced community quarantine, which is until now is still present in the transitory sites. This make women, including young women and girls, as primary carers at home, and with the high level of stress brought about by this crisis, they become more vulnerable to domestic violence. So young women and girls in transitory sites have limited access. Also, young women and girls in transitory sites that we've worked with has limited access to sanitary and hygiene products. For relief packages do not routinely include sanitary and hygiene kits for them. So these are the realities that we've seen, as we work with the communities, with our partner communities. So my next point, I think, is to strengthen young women participation. I think we also need to work with young women and girls in developing the skills for effective advocacy and engaging young women peace builders and allies in political discourse. I think we can do this by creating more opportunities for young women to reinforce our agency. One is creating a platform to share our expertise, develop our expertise, and receive validation and support, especially for youth with less experience. And in our network, like for instance, last August, we had an online training of trainers on WPS and YPS and the Beijing Plus 25 with our network members. And also another thing I think is the power of network. I think another way to strengthen participation of young women is, linking us up with other youth groups and tapping the power of collective voice. For example, capacity building programs and networks such as Young Women Plus for Peace and Leadership in the Philippines, brought together otherwise unconnected young women and allies from the different parts of the country. And we've created ideas that we have never thought of individually. And this has given us a platform to explore our potential for collective expression and action and in amplifying our work. So I think global networks, international advocacy is very important, but we also need to invest and support youth-led initiatives, especially the informal networks. What makes WPS tangible in the communities are the people who work in the local communities, and that includes young women and male allies. Yes, they are doing a lot of work already, but most of which are with meager resources and on volunteer labor. Imagine the magnitude of change we can do if we invest to amplify and scale up these youth-led initiatives. So I think it is important that women's peace building is locally driven, but also it's important to say that it should be with international support. So I think I'll end here for now. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Lynn Rose, for reminding us. I mean, first and foremost, the resourcing that is needed to get to women of all diversities on the ground, and to be able to support young women, but also as a reminder for those of us who weren't so young when 1325 was adopted, that we've got a very key role to play in not just saying this is about intergenerational leadership, but also start to really pave the way and also support young women's leadership to come into those spaces. So I'd like to ask all of you a very quick question in line with the work of Community of Democracies, but also the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals has a specific goal, 16, that actually makes the linkages between peace building and development and democracy. So from your perspective, as we talk about strengthening democracies and not political structures as well as social and economic structures. So how can the WPS agenda contribute to the implementation of goals of democratization, of strengthening democracy, and promoting, peace and democracy? Marita, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's absolutely very strongly interlinked, and there are numerous synergies. We know that the women play before a crisis affects the level of women's engagement in peace and security efforts during a crisis. If women are on key committees and take part in decision-making in times of peace, women are more likely to do so in times of conflict. But conflict also changes societies and its demography. More men than women die, go missing, are away fighting, emigrate to avoid fighting, or prepare a life elsewhere. Often women are left to take care of their families and to rebuild their communities. And so, we've even heard this now, but in this situation, women have to fill new roles, sometimes without the legal or cultural legitimacy or the access required to what they simply have to. Paid work where this is not allowed, political office where this is not accepted. Some women take up arms or find a space for political agency within militias. And some women might appreciate the new freedom and responsibility that a new situation brings. For some, it's a burden. But no matter the reason or the motivation, gender roles are often challenged in times of war. We saw that in Norway as well, 70 years ago. As peace is restored to a society, there is a window, we know this, of opportunity for women's rights, building on women's agency during conflict. But there are also often very strong forces that try to return women to their rightful place. This is not only deeply unjust, it also generates frustration and potential unrest. And it represents a colossal loss of opportunity for the societies in question. Therefore, working for women's political participation is an important part of reconstruction efforts after a conflict. Women's political participation is crucial for the successful implementation of a peace accord and for the building of sustainable peace. And all of this work that we try to do that is connected with the peace process, all this women, peace and security work builds the platform for inclusive political processes post-conflict and for inclusive and well-functioning democracies where women play their rightful roles also in politics.
Thank you so much, Marita. It's so important to bring women, into that continuum of building, rebuilding peaceful societies. And obviously, democratization is clearly one. Lynn Rose, from your experience as a young woman and maybe thinking about it from a local governance level, how can we make the connection better?
Thank you, Sharon. I think I would start with saying that gender equality is the building block of democracy, and this agenda is key to sustainable democracy. So for me, with the work that we do, the importance of women, including young women's meaningful participation, is embodied in this agenda. And this is an instrument in ensuring that the voices and meaningful participation of youth, including young women, are amplified in spaces, especially in political decision-making processes, which will shape their future and the future generations to come. So with, like the 20th commemoration of 1325, I think this is a call to transform systems of power within our societies that generates inequality and violence to build sustainable democracy. Moving forward, I think we need to focus on the lack of political will to holistically implement the WPS agenda. As we are, confronted with the global health crisis, I think the participation of women, including young women, in all political and decision-making processes becomes even more urgent. In our network, for example, we have 3 members of the Youth Council in their communities, and having a network strengthens the capacity building support of these elected young women, which helps empower them to have more impact on decision-making processes. They are at the front lines of the COVID response, and in support, what we did, in support to their work, we launched the Young Women at the Front Lines campaign to recognize their heroism for risking their lives amidst the crisis. So they have been champions of inclusive, gender-sensitive, family-centered, and nonviolent response to COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that the vulnerable sectors are not left behind. Another thing that I could also share in our network is that we also engage our young women peace builders and allies in political discourses and activities. In our networks, one of our programs are community discussions to increase awareness of youth on our civic political responsibilities. We organized a forum, for example, and campaign on Bangsamoro Organic Law during the plebiscites on the ratification of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. That's the law that created the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. And also to aid low voters turnout during our elections, we organized youth discussions to educate young voters on systemic implications of voting. So I think these activities aimed at addressing participation obstacles that young women face in the electoral processes and their ability to exercise their vote. This also helps in increasing young women's political literacy as citizens and voters and enhances their knowledge of national laws and policies, as well as, like international agreements and conventions on women's rights. So I think in WPS agenda, the democratic ideals of inclusiveness and accountability are integrated in creating a community where women, including young women, can reach their potential on an equal basis with men, whatever they choose to do. So yeah, over to you, Sharon.
Yes, thank you, Lynn Rose. It's clearly an ongoing piece of work. It's not just, got elections, so let's quickly mobilize. But, throughout the electoral cycle, throughout peace building, that continuum of peace building. And if I could now turn to Raluca, because your work, particularly in Haiti, when you were deployed there, and working with the Haitian National Police, was really about making the linkage with the WPS agenda and the rule of law in a very difficult situation. How did you manage? What was your approach in getting the police to recognize that women were essential for in this rule of law work? Raluca?
Yeah, the question is very well put. I can say that what I saw in comparison with my first UN mission I had been into, my first and the second one. I noticed that after 2014, the number of women participating in Haiti mission increased. And I believe that the increased number of women in peacekeeping, it's a start because we have to stress also the importance of women in leadership in the context of policies and programs concerning peacekeeping and security. And working with the Haitian police officers was a challenge because unfortunately the education it's not very developed. It wasn't so developed in Haiti. So even in the society, in Haitian society, we saw a big difference between men and women. So women were staying home, taking care of the kids, working, and so on. And men, they could go and work and choose a profession. So what I have noticed was that if we lead by example, and if we go and implement what we have been taught in our countries that we have equal rights, men, women, and we can and teach the other participants in the peace building, because it's not about the peacekeepers. The peace is built also with the locals, teaching them that they should be courageous and they should respect equality, because we are half women, half men. We should be half represented everywhere. I think that little by little things change everywhere if we want to. So basically, I'm always saying that we should lead by example. And from my experience, I have learned that peace is built with each and every one of us. So Doesn't matter if it's me, Raluca, or my other UN colleague, or a Haitian police officer, or even a victim of a crime in Haiti. If we understand that we are equal in front of the law and in front of God, of course, then we can change things and we can build peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raluca. We could continue to have a conversation with you just about your experience in Haiti, but for now it's time for some interaction with our audience. So I understand we have the first question coming from Sophia. Daria, I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your first introductory speeches. My name is Sophia, and I work as a research assistant at the Native Parliamentary Assembly. And my question will be to those of you who deal with climate change, but not specifically. So in the last annual report on women, peace and security, UN Secretary General acknowledged the role of climate change as a threat multiplier that exacerbates the already increasing number of complex emergencies, which disproportionately affect women and girls. But from your perspective and from your experience potentially, can we look at this issue from a bit different perspective? For example, where taking action to fight climate change provides opportunities for women empowerment and women leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. And I believe we have another question from Madeline.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes, I actually had a question. Well, first of all, thank you for this panel today. It's very interesting. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. I think multiple panelists discussed both meaningful participation in peace processes of women and also the importance of including a diverse subsection of women in these processes. I just wanted to ask, what measures or what can we do more to ensure the diversity of women's voices at all stages of peace processes, especially given that, as we mentioned briefly, women in general still aren't very well represented, especially in peace talks. So how can you ensure that it's not just a certain kind of women's voice and that it's different perspectives?
Thank you so much, Sophia and Madeline. So if I could invite the panelists, how can we change the climate crisis narrative to an inclusive climate security approach, one that actually leads to and empowers young women's leadership, and also within the context of participation? We've already talked about the fact that we as women are not a homogeneous group, and our lived realities required a shift from that siloed approach to an inclusive, intersectional approach throughout the peace building cycle. So maybe we could start in Rose for your thoughts in response to Sophia and Madeline.
Maybe on the first question, it's a very interesting question because the threat of climate change and other climate hazards, I believe, is not gender neutral. And women, and particularly young women living in rural areas, are more vulnerable to adverse impacts of climate change, and this is very real in the Philippines. If you look at climate change index, we are the third riskiest country in the world when it comes to natural disasters. We're the 13th most climate vulnerable country and 5th most affected country by weather-related loss. And even now, we have some parts of the country is experiencing typhoon at the moment. So I think with that question, I think I'll go back, I'll put more emphasis on our rural women, because our rural women are often farmers, foresters, and fishers, and agricultural crops and fish are their main source of income, as well as their main source of food. And in our country, rural women, this includes young women as well, are holders of knowledge and should be partners in crafting solutions to address climate emergencies. And I think investing in led and young women-led sustainable solutions to climate change help build disaster resilience at the community level. And I think that's very, very important to emphasize. And, at the same time, it improves, resilience at the community level. It also improves women and young women's economic empowerment. So and at the same time, so empowering rural young women will enable to be enable them to be increasingly part of the solution in the fight against climate change. And I think it starts with the need to recognize their key role in in participating in the design and implementation of climate change responses, because most of these things like stops at the local level. It never gets to the table where they can help shape action plans, national action plans when it comes to climate emergency. So I think the knowledge and expertise that women and young women have on food security and building community resilience are vital in addressing climate change. And I think building a more resilient Philippines, in thinking of Philippines in the context of COVID, for example. And I think on the second question, although I made mention about this already in my previous intervention, for me, when it comes to, we need to bring more, I think, male allies in the advocacy. So I think, and we've been doing that in our network. Our network is named Young Women Plus, and the plus there is for our men and LGBTQIA allies in our advocacy. So we also feature, we have a campaign on 1325. We started 2 days ago, and we highlighted male allies in our campaign, highlighting their role in advocating for 1325. And, this highlights the significant role of male champions for gender equality and advocacy partnerships, because we always get this, narrative that, the women peace agenda is, revolving around women as well. It's not, we are all in this together. So we need to emphasize that. Another thing is that we need to hold our governments accountable, because it's our right to be on in those spaces. And the WPS agenda is a mechanism, and also I want to bring in the intersection of women peace and security and youth peace and security, because that has been the two agenda that we used in forwarding our advocacy in galvanizing space for youth and young women in formal peace processes, for example. So I think that's it on my end. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn Rose. So maybe if I could ask Raluca, from your experience in peacekeeping deployments, how were you able to balance the participation, bring the diversity of women into the processes, and as well as deal with humanitarian crisis response? Raluca?
Yes, from my experience, as you know, Haiti does not have the greatest infrastructure that we can experience. And sometimes the population has a lack of running water. And what I can see is that I was everybody were in during our cholera outbreak, where water was very important, for example, and we had issues with running water. We had issues with buying it, because even us, it was very expensive. Even imagine for the Haitian people. So I believe that climate change is also affects not only women but us in general. And as women, we are responsible with housing, with cleaning, with making sure that our family is safe, and is also healthy. I can say that climate change impacts very much, impacts also the life of women in certain times, like I'm saying it was the cholera outbreak, or now with the COVID situation. Running water, it's important. Having things that for some of us seem very usual and common, having running water coming out from the wall. Sometimes we don't even wonder where is it coming from, but still. Yes, climate change affects a lot the role of the woman in a society, and we should have an impact with building, with helping communities to have better infrastructure, and also teaching people how to save water, or how to be to take care of the nature and of everything that we have been given as a gift from Lord. Thank you.
Thank you, Raluca. And right on to Marita. Marita, obviously your experience in addressing a number of these agenda items or in the questions have come up. So what are some of the best approaches that we can be taking right now?
You're talking now about the question about inclusion, I suppose, yeah?
Inclusion,
Or both of
and
them.
also in the context of climate change as well,
Okay.
because
Yes.
even in climate change processes, we're seeing a certain type of representation.
Absolutely. Well, I think, first of all, on the climate aspect of things, I'd like to primarily say I agree with the former speakers. I think it's obvious that women are often, first responders when there is a crisis, even if it's a natural disaster. It's obvious that women are very much involved in agriculture and those kinds of activities that are very early hit by climate change. Therefore, they know what is happening, and they often have experience in dealing with the problems also. And so they have obvious competence that is required, need to be consulted. And that kind of knowledge could also enhance women's leadership, give them more legitimacy, and could also potentially give a political leverage. So all of that, I think, is well said by the former speakers, my colleagues. I think you're right. I think we do have to be inserting gender into all these discussions and appointing women to take part in key positions and key delegations that discuss these matters. And I'm happy to say that for us, two of our priorities when we take our seat on the Security Council in January will be climate, peace and security, and women, peace and security. And we are looking at the crossovers and the synergies in that regard, which I think are absolutely essential. As for the inclusion part, how do we do that to ensure that we're not talking only with the capital women, but also the rural women, and we're not only talking with the straight women, but also the gay community, that we talk with ethnic minorities, indigenous women, differently abled women, religious minorities, traditional leaders, women and men. I think it's complicated. I think we need to agree that it's also easy, because women, peace and security is really about a paradigm shift in a way. It's about opening up the space and saying all those who are affected are stakeholders, and if there are major grievances that are not dealt with, that need to be rectified. So I'm not proposing that in every at every peace table everyone should be represented exactly the way society is. I don't think at this point that is realistic. I think at times there are phases and times where smaller groups need to meet. But the point is that we need to ensure that all of the grievances and all of the lurking problems that could destabilize our societies and prohibit resources to emerge, those need to be handled with care and as an asset for the peace process in some way or another. I think we will not be, I think at this point, we're looking at consultations to a large extent. We're looking at representation at the main table, and then we're looking at consultations on various tracks. I believe that one of the major challenges that I'm extremely concerned with, and we keep discussing it all the time, is how do we ensure that there's an uptake? Because we can consult, but unless there is some kind of responsibility, pick up the messages that have come out of the consultations and see that they are reflected on the agenda and for the parties to deal with, then I don't know. Then we're just spending a lot of time enhancing expectations without really dealing with them. So I think consultations are necessary, but uptake is necessary as well. And at times we need to just make sure that we include more people at the main table, because their grievances are of such a nature that they cannot be overlooked.
Thank you so much. Just this week, in fact, we're having conversations 6 specificities called the Shifting the Power Coalition around the connection between WPS, the humanitarian agenda, the climate change agenda. And while we've been talking about redesigning the table, we've also said that while we wait for the table to be redesigned, we're also starting to weave our own maps so we can sit down and have conversations in our own communities. Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So to wrap up this conversation, I'm going to ask our panelists to provide one key takeaway or recommendation specifically for the Community of Democracies Governing Council member states on how they can advance the WPS agenda, maybe as an operationalization recommendation, but linked to our theme for today, engaging women in sustaining peace. Marita, I'll hand it back to you.
Yes, okay. A main focus for Norway in the past few years has been to ensure that we don't only have policies and plans in place, but also guidelines, checklists, procedures that enable follow-up. We appoint women peace and security leads of our mediation teams, for instance, and we develop specific strategies for it. It can be quite simple that point us in a direction. We do this because we realize that we don't only need to know what to do, but also how to do it. I find that mostly there is very little resistance to doing the right thing, but there is at times considerable doubt as to how to do it. So what would be my recommendation to others, as well as to ourselves, to be more practical? Focus on providing concrete guidance to colleagues and partners so that we all understand what to do. Decide upon some actions and appoint focal points. Knows exactly what to do and what is expected from them.
Thank you, Marita. Lynn Rose, if I could ask you for your key takeaway messages, please.
I think we're just going to reiterate that, like what made WPS tangible in the communities are the people working in the local communities, and that includes young women and male allies. So I think we need to improve our financing. We have to provide more resources for these youth-led networks to scale up and amplify their existing initiatives. And also we need to provide a structured mechanism for participation through decision-making, all this decision-making tables. And, like we need to work with youth-led organizations, groups of young people, including young women and allies, to be partners. And we need to give youth a wider space to affect systemic change. So I think that's it from me. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Lynn Rose. And last but not least, Raluca. Wrap up the conversation.
So we have come a long way toward our goal, and I say let's not stop at this. Now that women, peace and security agenda is on the table, it must be discussed, it must be developed, it must be researched, and above all implemented. I think it's to all of us, strong women, to act and also lead the way. The best example that someone can give is our own behavior. I know that there are strong women and strong characters, and I think we should never stop fighting for our rights, and by showing our own example, we'll also make the difference. So thank you very much for your invitation. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Raluca. Thank you, Marita. And thank you, Lynn Rose, for continuing to remind us throughout our conversation today that progressing the WPS agenda is not just about the adoption of a Security Council resolution. Thank you for the work you do. Today's been a reminder as the UN Security open debate on 1325 in a few hours, I guess somewhere in New York, the work leading up to the adoption of 1325 more than 20 years ago. It's an important reminder because that's when women's activists, civil society stepped forward, supported by member states and the multilateral system, to undertake consultation and development processes to create Resolution 1325, ensuring that the resolution incorporated the needs and experiences of a diverse range of women. It truly from the Security Council. And today 1325 still has transformative capacities. It has brought women into the Security Council, but not always in peace processes. It has enabled women to be innovative and redesign processes to ensure our inclusion. We're seeing more women now also leading peacekeeping efforts. It's a reminder that progressing 1325 must remain true to its foundational values. So as we wrap up this evening, thank you once again to our speakers. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are across the globe. And finally, a big thanks to the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies, who has organized in cooperation with the Community of Democracies Working Group on Women and Democracies. So stay safe, stay well. Thank you.